Session 4 introduces the topic, how does a diffusion of power away from the Westphalian system impact the GPC? Helping to understand and answer this question are Dr. Jackson, an irregular warfare research and policy specialist. Ms. Elsa Kania is a technologies expert at the Center for New American Security, and Dr. Mary Habeck, who teaches a number of security-related topics at several universities and is the president of Applied Grand Strategies, a consulting firm. Dr. Jackson, would you lead off our discussion, please?
Since the end of World War II, the United States and its allies have promoted the creation of states that are that would serve as an interlocutor for us to be able to interact with that state. And originally, it was the idea that we would promote democracy and market economies and liberal trading order and all of these things that would tie together an international system that would compete against the Soviet Union's sort of countervailing system. In this process, we decided to kind of create a mirror image of ourselves, a set of bureaucracies, an idea of free elections and legal systems and constructs that were really copied from our own or the French or the British, and place them on top of societies which may or may not have had either the same goals, you know, like economic growth or democracy, or even individual human rights, which all sound very good to us, but when you actually start to talk to people in different systems, you find that maybe people have different values. So we attempted to do this, and in doing so, we created kind of a set of organizations that are there to interact with us. And this worked very well in places where there was being put atop a society that had a consolidated nation state, like say Germany or Japan. But in a place like Mali, or where the French put their own system on top of it, or in a place where we arrive, you know, later on, sort of skip forward to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we put a state on top of a society, often what we're doing is creating a something that is really just an organization that interacts with us, that has no contact with everything going on below it. And that's kind of the problem that I've seen in this clash between a pre-existing set of authority structures that are natural to that society and what we're trying to put on top of it. And this results in something that Joel Migdal wrote a very smart book called Strong Societies, Weak States, where he kind of tries to get at this. And he says, why is it that some states are able to change behavior in their societies? Why is it that some states are able to generate economic development? Why are they able to generate stability and security, and other states are not? And his answer is that there are these strong web-like social structures that will not let the state make these changes. And so this leads into sort of the discussion of state failure. So the first thing I want to do is clarify what I mean by that. Bill Zartman wrote the first book on state failure, and he defined it as when a state cannot generate the actions that are required of a state, such as having a monopoly on coercion within its own territory. And we'll get back to that in a second, like what is the function of a state? Because I actually think that once again, with our mirror imaging, we say, oh, you know, it has to have an education department, it has to have a finance ministry, it has to have exactly these things like we have. And sometimes that is actually crowding out a very powerful social structure that is underneath, that is actually governing and is fighting the state. And so, and then the other thing about this, this state organization is that the last thing that it wants is for the international community to be able to realize that this underlying authority structure, which is often bottom up and fragmented, actually has authority, because then why would the international community interact with this organization anymore? If they were going to do, say, an economic development program, they would want to do it through a tribal group that actually governs its own watan, or a home sort of tribal homeland. They would rather put that money in at the bottom, because then it would actually result in the action that the international community was looking for. So you then create an organization that you're putting money into that doesn't really generate actions down, but it deflects your efforts to push down. And this happens across all of the structures within that organization, to include the military structure, which, if you're trying to motivate someone to fight and kill and die for some purpose, starting with what their values are and what their original structure, their social structure is, that normally would motivate that kind of behavior, is really important. You can't just assume that everybody is like the French and they're gonna march to the train station at the beginning of World War I and get on the train and take a gun and be willing to fight in a trench for France. That's not necessarily how all societies are structured. So this overall leads to this state failure in some places that we're very familiar with. And from a great power competition perspective, what does that mean to us? Well, it means that you have left the international community and the United States without a mechanism to implement something it's trying to do. If it's trying to counter a violent extremist organization, or it's trying to counter Russian influence or Chinese influence, if that state cannot generate action that is of any value, then, or it makes any coherent pattern, then how are we supposed to implement a policy? And in Afghanistan, where I did my dissertation research, it was very clear that the government created no coherent set of patterns of action that people could react to. So, and think of what we spent on that. And in the meantime, there were these structures at the bottom that were actually governing, but the state didn't want us to talk to them. So it leaves us without a mechanism. It also leaves a vacuum into which any competitor can enter, to include non-state or state actors. And it also leaves these existing social structures and authority structures that an outside actor, Iran, Russia, China could do it, but doesn't do it very much, except a little bit in Burma, that are available to outside organizations. Like, we have failed to leverage these lower level organizations, but somebody else, that leaves it open so somebody else can. And I think that's where it comes in, the question of great power competition. And just to give you one brief example, in Helmand province, there are a couple of important tribes down there, and those tribes have fighting groups, and those fighting groups used to be part of the Taliban's Quetta Shura, but they no longer are, because there was a fragmentation inside of the Quetta Shura. Well, that resulted in those fighting groups becoming part of something called the Mashhad Shura, which currently controls roughly 70% of the fighters in the largest heroin producing region globally. And guess who's paying for those? The Quds Force. What does the Quds Force need? The Quds Force needs money for its global operations. So this can be very easily leveraged by various actors for their own ends and in great power competition. And additionally, the Russians are providing money to the Mashhad Shura because they're concerned about having influence after the United States leaves. So in conclusion, I just think it's awfully important that when we look at how we would like to interact in a place, whatever our objective is, what is the existing set of social and authority structures, and how can we use those to our advantage, as opposed to sort of repeating this system of trying to mirror image and creating a state that then fails if it doesn't match with the nation state construct that our society is built on. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Right on time. Appreciate your comments very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, this is going to be high adventure because we won't be able to see our next speaker, Ms. Elsa Kania. She is on her phone. Oh, I can't see you.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Apologies, I was in transit a moment ago, but I hope I'm sufficiently audible, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing the conversation this afternoon.
Well, you are sufficiently audible, and you look very energetic. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you all. I think it's definitely quite a moment to be thinking about great power competition and the shifting balance of power in the international system. And I suppose I should say by way of introduction that my background as an analyst and academic has been focused primarily on China, looking at the Chinese military and technological development. So I'll try in my remarks today to touch upon a couple of themes that relate to how I see US competition with China today as a systemic competition or as a contest of systems, so to speak, and try to speak to as well how Chinese leaders view the state of play today within the international system and when they regard the United States and how that relates to how we think about the diffusion of power, not just away from the Westphalian system in some respects with the rise of new domains and increased importance of new technologies, but also the increased importance of sub-state actors as contenders or stakeholders in the complex concurrence of cooperation and competition that we see playing out between the US and China today. So I think we can start off by saying, and I know this has been a theme throughout the competition, and throughout this conversation so far, that we are seeing a change in and challenges that are perhaps unprecedented to the world order as we know it or as we knew it. And Chinese leaders have for quite some time in their assessments of the world order regarded this as a shift towards multipolarity. And China has been inclined to try to go along with and adapt to that shift in some respects, even as a means of increasing its own influence in the process in the course of its rise. Whereas from the perspective of the CCP, the U.S. has been trying to resist and push back against the tendency towards multipolarity. And I think we can have some interesting debates about how we evaluate polarity or what it means. If we view this as an era of great power competition, is this a bipolar or perhaps tripolar world? With the US, China, and Russia as great powers, how do we think about the risks and role of non-state or sub-state actors in this endeavor, including with the increased importance of companies and their own power and capability within this environment? I think the other trend and theme that's important to take into account beyond multipolarity, that is a prominent feature of how Beijing sees this strategic competition, such as it is that of technological transformation. With the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, and consistently, the message under Xi Jinping, especially since the launch of the innovation-driven development strategy back in 2016, has been that the rise and fall of great powers in historical perspective has been driven by technology. And so too today, the advent of new disruptive technologies is a unique, perhaps historic opportunity for China to turn sharply to surpass, to undertake leapfrog development, to any number of different phrasings or framings that essentially amount to, again, seizing the commanding heights of new domains of technology, and to compete effectively in this evolving landscape, I think requires reconsidering how we regard innovation and the US and Chinese positions in that environment. And one of the reasons that I started in my own work to concentrate on innovation and the development of emerging technologies in China is that I was initially, at least circa 2015, 2016, concerned that the United States systematically underestimated China, that we had this sense of American exceptionalism when it came to innovation, and that we regarded ourselves as uniquely capable in that regard, and were consequently dismissive of the capacity of Chinese companies and entrepreneurs, of Chinese research universities and academic institutions, as well as world-class laboratories that are playing out within China. And when we think about the state of play in emerging technologies today, given that I study AI and how China's party state and the Chinese military use AI, I'm often asked some variant of the question, who is winning the AI race or the AI arms race, with the expectation that the answer may be the US or China, one or the other. And I think that that framing of the question illustrates some of the problems that we're facing when we try to think more creatively about these dynamics today. That there's a tendency to view the world through the lens of arms races and military competitions, that there's a tendency to think about the US and China as if each country were a unitary actor, when in fact there is so much variety and divergence, and you can see very different dynamics playing out depending on which level of analysis you choose to look upon. So for instance, to take the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, this has been a nadir in US-China relations between the two governments, with the breakdown of any expected cooperation and a very zero-sum mentality, and seeing the pandemic as a opportunity for competition. And yet throughout this whole tragedy, we've seen American and Chinese doctors and scientists and researchers, in fact, collaborating and cooperating on important research initiatives more so than ever. There have been some valuable bibliometric analyses that in fact have illustrated that the propensity for co-authorship has increased, again, against the backdrop of the talk of great power competition and the role of technology, and that we're seeing, again, very strong dynamics that are cooperative and collaborative, and of course competitive as well in many cases. If you look at American and Chinese researchers, enterprises, and academic institutions. And I think it's important to recognize that variation and to see that there are some respects, if we view the world as it is, still globalized for the most part, science is very open and international, and for the US to compete, we do have to continue to leverage that comparative advantage in our own right going forward. I think this is certainly quite a moment to be trying to make sense of these dynamics in the world when we look at not just the disruption caused by the pandemic, but also the ways in which that may prove to be something of an epochal moment for the world order as we know it. And again, I can speak more confidently perhaps to how Chinese leaders than relative to US leaders have regarded this, because Xi Jinping has been very clear and direct in how he characterized the pandemic as a crisis that presented a test of China's party state model, that presented a moment that would catalyze changes not seen in a century, is the phrasing that has consistently arisen in PRC state media to characterize this current moment. I think it's not inaccurate to say that the war, and it has even become a bit of a cliche to say that the world in the aftermath or with the continuation of COVID-19 will be very different from that which came before it. And we've seen Chinese leaders view this crisis as existential in character, as a challenge for their system, for their model, and fearing that if they did not successfully control the pandemic, this would mean a loss of their legitimacy. If they did not successfully sustain economic development, that they would not be able to maintain social stability going forward. And I think the unprecedented quarantines and the national mobilization that we saw in China in the course of their relatively successful, yet certainly uneven response to COVID-19 highlights the strengths and the weaknesses of that system, including the capacity to bring into play different sub-state actors, whether that is the Chinese military working and unifying with local actors, whether that is Chinese companies that are being enlisted to develop protective equipment, whether that was even the use of militia forces and coordination among central and local governments. So I think if we think about the capacity to compete, the capacity to mobilize and coordinate and bring to bear new stakeholders as elements of national power in an age where technology is all the more consequential, will be truly critical going forward. I think as we regard this competition, and in closing, I think we also have to recognize the perilous moment that we see in the United States today. And I worry sometimes, to be frank, and that we are squandering opportunities to compete by reinvesting in our own revitalization and trying to strengthen and bolster our institutions. And I think when we look at the trajectory of competition going forward, the choices that we make at home to ensure the viability of our democracy will be critical to how we can compete and position ourselves in the world stage going forward. So I'll stop there for now and very much look forward to continuing the conversation going forward.
Well, congratulations to our panelists so far. They've been both on time, so no pressure, Mary, but Dr. Habeck is our next presenter, and we look forward to your comments.
All right, thank you very much. So my comments are usually given in the context of at least an hour, and I'm going to squash them down into 10 minutes. So please forgive me for speaking very, very quickly, but I have 11 siblings, so I'm kind of used to it. What I'm going to do for you is provide you a perspective that is so far not been addressed, and that is the viewpoint of some of these non-state actors on the great power competition. So what do Al-Qaeda and ISIS think about the great power competition going forward? For first of all the great powers are equivalent enemies for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. They do not make a distinction amongst the kuffar, that is the infidels. All of them need to be dealt with in exactly the same way. They need to be crushed. All atheists and those they call polytheists and those who are not their sort of monotheist need to be killed or converted. I cannot stress that enough. For them, the Chinese communists are atheists who either are going to convert to Islam or need to be killed. All Hindus need to either convert to Islam, their version of Islam, a very extreme version of Islam, or they need to be killed off. So this is not something that is seen by them as being a competition in which they can simply withdraw. They believe, in fact, they're involved in an existential conflict. Russia, China, the US, EU, all of the great powers are classified as being their enemies. However, some of them are seen as being enemies for right now, and others are enemies for later. And they also have what they call the methodology or menhaj, which they are using in order to determine their strategic actions over the next 100 years or so. They believe that this conflict will last for 200 years. The actions of Russia and China have proven to them that these are just as serious enemies, and perhaps for this particular phase of the menhaj, even more serious than the United States, who has been neutralized. Why is the EU, though, an enemy? Not just because they're a bunch of infidels, but also for ISIS in particular, they have become the enemies for two separate reasons. One explains, in my opinion, the attack on Vienna. That is, they're in a competition, a terrorist competition with Al-Qaeda that carried out those attacks in France. And for them, they cannot allow that to stand. So their competition with Al-Qaeda is actually driving a lot of their actions. But in addition, they have threatened everyone who has taken part in the war against them. And so ISIS believes they can use terror in order to influence people's actions and force them to do what they want. But let me stress again, for all of them, all of these countries are equivalent enemies. It just depends on which particular stage of the methodology you're in, whether they believe you need to be targeted at this precise moment. Al-Qaeda, however, thinks more strategically and long-term than ISIS does. And their classification of enemies was worked out in 2002 by Saif al-Adil, a man who is currently somewhere high up in their organization, and who has, at that point in 2002, was the head chief of their intelligence. He put out a document in which he classified enemies, including the United States and others, according to their current threat to to what he thinks of as the true Muslims, that is, everybody who agrees with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and placed them in 4 separate categories. Number 1 on the list were those people who are known as the Jewish Crusaders. And here I'd like to emphasize this because you have to understand that these non-state actors are working off of a conspiratorial, let's put it that way, I would say crazy conspiratorial vision of the world. And according to this conspiratorial vision of the world, Jews actually run the world and everybody else is just their puppets. And so the Jewish Crusaders include the United States, Russia, and the EU. And all of them were seen as being equivalent enemies who had to be taken on first. So this is all of the threats and everything that were against the United States during the 1990s, right up through 9/11, were not meant to be just about the United States. They were about all of the Jewish Crusaders. But he also believed that it would be possible to neutralize as many of his enemies as possible. By neutralizing, what Al-Qaeda means is putting them in a position where they cannot carry out attacks against us, or actually negotiating in order to make them into neutral parties in this conflict. In addition, Al-Qaeda has worked on their minhaj and been altering it and reforming it according to circumstances since it was first written down in about the 1990s straight through to today. And in those stages, there are various stages in which you want to be in competition with these great powers, and there are other stages where you don't, where you believe in fact that you've won and you have pushed them out of your territory that you want to focus on. That is, during your strategic defensive phase, you have treated them so badly, they've been forced to retreat from your territory. And then you enter something called equilibrium with them, no war, no peace, in which you won't carry out attacks against them in order to keep them neutral so that you can focus on institution building and the creation of your own state. And here's where I'm going to make a kind of contrary statement for everybody here. Al-Qaeda, just like ISIS, wants to create a state. They want to become a state, not a nation state, a state that will have no borders or boundaries, that won't recognize Westphalia or anything about Westphalia, and that will always be expanding, just like ISIS. They argued, however, in 2014, as early as 2014, that ISIS had gotten the timing wrong and had skipped stages of the minhaj or methodology and were therefore doomed to failure. So in their mindset, this was the collapse of the so-called caliphate was always going to happen, and they were in fact counting on it. They, on the other hand, following the minhaj, which is, by the way, based both on the life of Muhammad, his sirat, but also based on Mao and Job. So according to them, what they needed to do was create the preconditions for a state before you actually set up a state. And that meant at some point you were going to have to neutralize all of your enemies, get them out of your territories, and set about building the conditions, the preconditions for a state. That, according to them, occurred in 2011 when the United States chose to leave Iraq and Afghanistan and begin to withdraw from the Middle East. They believed they had defeated the United States and we had retreated, crushed, exhausted, incapable of threatening them. Therefore, they began to stop carrying out attacks against us and instead focused on institution building in all of those countries that they believe they control territory. So I'd just like to point out to you that this creates a whole set of asymmetries for us that are very difficult for us to deal with. None of us, except possibly China, believes this is an existential conflict. None of us is willing to do anything possible in order to take these guys on and defeat them. They, on the other hand, believe this is an existential conflict. They're willing to use any means possible in order to defeat us. And by the way, we're not unified on who the enemy is, how he should be fought, what it would even mean to win, what are our objectives and end states in this war. None of us can agree upon that. And all those are things that Al-Qaeda and, by the way, ISIS agree upon. The result is every one of the great powers is being outplayed by a so-called non-state actor. In 2011, the United States could look around the world and think pretty good things about how it was going. I mean, the Arab Spring was going to get rid of violence. We were going to go back to politics. I remember being so hopeful during that time. And instead, you went from 4 insurgencies run by the extremists to 21 today, 21 insurgencies. The collapse of Africa. Nobody's paying attention in the United States. We don't care about Africa, apparently. But, you know, when one of our greatest partners, Burkina Faso, suddenly collapses into a chaotic mess, we need to start paying attention. It's not just them. It's heading southward right through the entire continent. And the spread of what I call chaotic messes in places like Libya, Syria, Yemen, where you don't even have a government anymore, is the sign that they are, in fact, displacing that nation state and replacing it with their own form of governance, which they hope eventually will turn into one province of their global caliphate. And by the way, the failure of every single one of the great powers to definitively defeat this enemy. We cannot point to one country that has managed to defeat Al-Qaeda and or ISIS, walk away, and not seen it simply pop up again. And this is not about our African partners or the coalitions or the local coalitions that have gone into places like northern Nigeria or Somalia or elsewhere. This is about us. This includes France that went into Mali, but was incapable of creating a permanent solution to the problems there. This includes us in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were unable to create permanent solutions to the problems. We defeated those guys over and over again, and yet we walked away and it all comes back. The return time and time again of Al-Qaeda and ISIS show, in fact, that we are facing an enemy that might be smarter than us, that is certainly more dedicated than us, and it doesn't matter that they don't have a state to rely on. Thanks.
I'm always a little apprehensive when I see the term Westphalian system. 30 years ago, when I started doing public speaking on non-state actors, when you do that, you have to establish the base. So what's a state actor? So I would ask the first question, who in here in the room or audience can tell me what the Treaty of Westphalia was? And actually, it's two treaties, and you know, 30 years ago, I would get a lot of raised hands, and they would say, well, you know, it started the state system. I just did this 5 months ago to a university audience, and I got probably 40 students were in there and one person raised their hand, which makes you wonder if we all understand what the Westphalian state system is and what it's supposed to be. I just say that because we've used terms in here like Cold War, but there are many in our audience that don't understand really what the Cold War was. So I'm glad you articulated what the Westphalian system is. So to start our questions, we have several from the audience, and I might try and compress some of them, but one has to do with China. We have a China expert. So what dependencies does the CCP still have on the Western world as it develops linkages between technology and manufacturing? And I guess maybe the question might be, does the CCP really take advantage of its position in a Westphalian world? So I will start with actually Dr. Jackson, if we could start us off, and I'll give everybody an opportunity to answer that question in order. Thank you.
Wait, you're asking me what the CCP...
Yeah, the question, not mine, from the audience says, what dependencies does the CCP still have on the Western world as it develops linkages between technology and manufacturing? And I don't know if I can paraphrase that. Many think that the CCP has taken advantage of the world community. Mm-hmm. And as they continue, what will they still be dependent, or perhaps can they sort of make their own way, I guess is a better way of asking that question.
So I think that,
okay.
What? I think that if you look at the international economic system and the way that China was integrated into the WTO, I think that they've been riding an existing system that was producing technology and absorbing, and producing and absorbing finance and all of these resources from the international system, and they're pulling them into their own system in order to produce a competing system, which I think is very interesting because it's basically like playing a double game, as people often say about them. And the real question that I have is, if they are actually planning to go to some other mode, where you're going to say next, we're going to move to an authoritarian system where everybody's model looks like ours, semi-planned economy, top-down, authoritarian, surveillance system, the whole thing, or whether that or whether that actually is not something they intend to export. But if it is something they intend to export, I think that the question, I don't think I can answer the question as to how dependent they are, but I can say that a good question is, at what point do we decide, if we decide, that they are a threat? And that is actually kind of the central question in the whole interaction. So,
Dr. Jackson, you did brilliantly. The question wasn't for you, but you.
I know, that's why I was like, okay.
The question was for Ms. Kania, please. I didn't. The question is yours, Ms. Kania. Elsa, that's yours, but actually we'll give everybody a chance to answer it. So, Ms. Kania, please.
All right, sorry, I was blocked from unmuting myself for a moment there, but I hope you can all hear me now. Yes, technical difficulties are one of the few consistencies in life these days, and on that theme, I'd say as well that for all that we hear Chinese leaders boast about innovation capabilities, there are still technical difficulties and dependencies when it comes to China's innovation ecosystem and its distinct limitations on some fronts. And it's a pretty surefire proposition that any priority in a PRC S&T plan that is that for which there are still shortfalls domestically is likely to be a target of cyber and human espionage beyond China's borders. So certainly it is fair to say that the licit and illicit transfer and absorption of foreign technologies has been an enabler and accelerant of China's ongoing modernization, whether we're thinking about economic development or the growing strength of its military capabilities. And certainly this has enabled China to leapfrog ahead quite a bit more quickly than it might have otherwise. And this can speak to some of the advantages of backwardsness, so to speak. And certainly this notion of a model in which the state plays a stronger role in driving development by marshaling resources and trying to absorb foreign technological advancements is not unique to China, but China has done this at a scope and scale that is relatively unique. And again, I was recently contributed a chapter to a edited volume that addressed ways in which China has been transferring technology beyond espionage, and some of which I'd recommend to those interested, co-edited by Bill Hannes and Didi Tatlow, and definitely there's a quite extensive research and documentation on these issues. But at the same time, I think we're starting to see a change in at least the aspirations of Chinese leaders, if not the capabilities. So I think I worry sometimes that to say that we could cut off China from the US market or our innovation ecosystem, for instance, and thereby halt their progress would be a dangerous assumption, and one that could result in suboptimal policy solutions if we undertake measures that are maximalist and could cause more collateral damage to the openness that is so critical to our own strength and competitiveness. And I worry sometimes that while the reactions we've seen in terms of greater screening and greater restrictions are entirely justified, that it's too little too late, and forgive me for mixing metaphors here, but we're to close the barn door after the horses have already all run. And if we burn down the barn in the process, then that does not do much good to us either. So again, I think there is quite a bit of genuine progress that's happening within China today, again, enabled by not only transfer, but the globalized character of innovation today, which does diffuse power away from states and mean that much more of the progress is openly available to begin with. And that being said, there are still bottlenecks, there are still distinct limitations, there are still what Xi Jinping has called key and core technologies that are priorities, but also problems. And of course, semiconductors have often been pointed to as a prime example of that in terms of the targeting and limitations of China's own capabilities. And the moves against Huawei, which is quite an interesting example of a sub-state actor in and of itself, something of an illustration of that dynamic. And when companies in the space, companies that are in an industry that's fairly integrated across multiple countries and borders, are become such critical actors in a technology that's a strategic foundation for all of modern information technology, I think that does, again, highlight the importance of sub-state actors and the question as to whether China will succeed in moving beyond a dependence towards what Chinese leaders have been saying for quite some time and are now closer to achieving. That is the capacity to really not just be followers or fast followers trying to catch up, but to be true leaders when it comes to the frontiers of technologies where the US does not have and may not ever achieve a decisive advantage.
All right, thank you very much. I'm glad I got the question to the right participant. But Dr. Habeck, would you like to comment on the question? I saw that as a no.
No, I really feel that my value added for everyone here would be to focus on the violent extremists. Although I do also have an interest in the WPS implementation plan.
Okay. So my next question, I'll leave up to all three, but I think two of you would want to comment, certainly want to comment on this. So, I mean, absent a Westphalian system, state system of some type, can informal or traditional values and governance structures be used to generate positive influence with relevant populations, particularly in developing countries such as Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, among other places? I think we've heard that there's a possibility that local structures may be able to, in certain circumstances, replace Westphalian systems. So, Dr. Habeck, would you like to try that one? And then I'll get to Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, actually, let's start with Dr. Jackson. This is right up her alley, and I could see her nodding along with this, eager to answer.
All right, I'm trying to be impartial here, you know. Dr. Jackson, this is your question.
I think that traditional systems, if we think of the nation state as having begun as a set of sub-state groups that were then aggregated into what became the European nation that is attached then to the nation state, a lot of the problem that we have when we try to put something on top of another system, there are two problems. One of them is if the state just represents one system, but there are actually multiple systems inside of the territory, which often leads to a civil war. But there are other situations where it's actually disaggregated. So Afghanistan is an example of that, where there are actually very powerful local authority figures who have really seriously Orwellian control over people's behavior in their community, and like the size of like 200 households. Nothing ever gets stolen inside a community in Afghanistan. People don't rape people. Nobody gets in fights. The reason is because if you do, this guy who's in charge called the Wakil, who is a consensus-based authority figure. And I'm describing Afghanistan, but this is actually very similar to Arab tribes. It's very similar to some of the research I did in Mali about local authority figures. And you find this idea that we as a group decide something, and then we provide resources when we decide that there's a problem, and this is the solution we're gonna have to the problem. And that the real problem that happens with the imposition of a state organization on the top of this is that it acts as a block. So instead of bringing together all these groups and adding them up on shared problem sets, like I don't want the Taliban to come into my community and tell me what the rules are and beat people. And I agree with this, and the Wakil next door agrees with this, and everybody agrees with just this one point. And you could organize them around it, but it can't happen because you've created a state which opposes any other aggregated organization in the territory. So I think that these traditional structures can be tremendously useful in adding together consensus-based groups that agree on limited things that we are seeking. And that it is, in fact, in the case of a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, much better than creating a state in which different social groups or militias or armed groups or former exiles seize control of ministries and then just sort of hand out jobs, but the ministry doesn't do anything. And then the local traditional authority groups don't do anything either. So, and I also think that from a GPC perspective, we're not the only people who could do this, I guess is what I'm saying. And actually Al-Qaeda and ISIS have done a very good job of trying to leverage or coerce at this level, but they have failed in one significant respect, which is that they don't believe in consensus. They believe they know the rules. And that's an opening for us, but we don't take it. And I think it's sad. So anyway, there you go.
Would either of our other panelists like to address that question?
I can share a couple of musings on systems, on governance, and on the implications for the world order that sort of build upon those themes. And to return to Dr. Jackson's earlier question about the degree to which we may see the CCP starting to promote or export its model, I think this is a question that has really profound potential implications for how we think about what's really at the crux of great power competition such as it is today. And the first question that I'd raise, that I don't have a clear answer to myself and have yet to hear a clear answer to otherwise, though I'm sorry I haven't been able to make more of the forum discussion, is what exactly do we mean by great power competition in terms of our desired end state? What is it we're hoping to see the world look like? Are we hoping to preserve the status quo despite the forces that are catalyzing change and creating disruption? Do we have an openness to reforms, to adaptation, to a recognition of perhaps greater multipolarity, or a shift away from a traditional system centered on states with the rise of companies, for instance, as major stakeholders that are, especially when it comes to, for instance, fields like AI that have far more power and capability than most militaries or governments. So yeah, I think we can expect to continue to see some degree of diffusion of power come along with this kind of technological transformation. Yet at the same time, we can expect to see states attempt to assert their traditional prerogatives. So for instance, China's concept of cyber sovereignty and its promotion as a model that is regarded as relatively successful by Chinese leaders and has gained more traction around the world. I think that is a interesting illustration of how Westphalia can strike back, and credit to Dr. Krstemchek for being the first to raise the argument. We'd see a cybered Westphalian system, of an argument of which I was skeptical at the time, but now I'm afraid we are moving more and more in that direction, especially when we in the United States start to, in our own system, in our own model, pursue policies that to some degree converge with China's chosen approach and that move away from our traditional defense of internet freedom. You know, this raises difficult questions of how to think about the governance of social media platforms, the role of the state relative to companies when it comes to questions of control and authority. Who says what is mis or disinformation? Who has that authority? Is it a state? Is it a company? And what happens when this crosses borders and when you have the nation of Twitter or Facebook with perhaps more influence on geopolitics than many countries in the world today? And I think this does also concentrate power in the hands of individuals. And the CCP's answer has been to assert greater party-state control over companies and to try to harness them as members of a national team or as national champions to that end. And it's not entirely a state-controlled or directed system. There is market competition, but there's a much heavier hand and much heavier regulatory approach. And I think we have to look critically at that system as it is and recognize that it does have genuine appeal to countries around the world, especially those struggling with fraught problems for which we in the US have not proposed a compelling alternative or solution so far. And things like the Clean Network Initiative that we've seen raised recently propose banning and exclusion of Chinese companies from the US that parallels the banning and exclusion we've seen of American companies in China. And again, that can be justified as reciprocity in the name of great power competition, but it does take us further away from having a model or system that is a true alternative. And I think there are a lot of questions that will arise about values, about how do we compete in a way that is consistent with our values, which has to start with living up to them at home and trying to ensure that our systems of governance are carrying out those principles, so that the model that China is presenting, whether it's the Chinese way of fighting COVID-19, quote unquote, or the Chinese approach to internet sovereignty, does not gain greater traction, because there are certainly, whether it's emulation or the deliberate exportation of these kinds of approaches, I think there are reasons for concern that that model is gaining some ground today on several fronts.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Habeck, I feel like I've shortchanged you, so I have two questions for you. The first is in regards to the DoD WPS Strategic Framework Implementation Plan. Can you discuss gender perspectives on China and how the joint force can address China? I'm not sure about the last part of that question. And if you'd like the second question, I'll give you that because it has your name on it too. Would you anticipate Chinese investments would come under more regular pressure from jihadist groups in Africa and other places if the United States were not in the picture? Would it rise in relevance to them? And I think that rise is Chinese investments. So two questions. I'll repeat the second one if you need it later.
Yes, actually I'm going to address the second one first because I was just in touch with Natalie about meeting up with her afterwards to talk about this. So the second one though is very interesting. Why haven't we seen more attacks on Chinese investments or other things around Africa, for instance? There are several answers to that from the perspective of the violent extremists. So first of all, ISIS would be the ones who would be most likely to carry out those sorts of attacks because they don't think strategically and long term, and they kind of just let their id go wild. So they would be the ones who would want to do that sort of thing and not think about the long-term effects of it. On the other hand, Al-Qaeda is well aware that Chinese investment for some of their target audience, the people they're seeking to win over and recruit, targeting those investments would in fact harm them and turn them against Al-Qaeda. And so they are willing to put that on the back burner until they can win over people more to their perspective, and then they're likely to do something about it. They hate the Chinese and what is happening to the Uyghur people. And they have targeted messaging on this multiple times to their audiences in order to recruit. And it's been a massive recruiting effort and has worked. A lot of people are signing up in order to fight with them. And by the way, Uyghurs in places like Turkey are going off to fight in Syria and elsewhere because of the way that their fellow ethnic group is being treated in China. So that's the sort of perspective of Al-Qaeda on this. And again, not to beat a dead horse here, but they have they're really patient. They think very strategically, and they're willing to do things that people here were a little bit hesitant to say that a non-state actor would do, like do consultation or compromise or things like that. This is why they are seen as being a moderate group in contrast to the extremists of ISIS, but it's not true at all. Back in 2005, Zawahiri sent off a letter to Zarqawi, who is the founder and the real id master of ISIS today, in which he said, "We don't want to see scenes of slaughter from you. You're cutting people's throats on videos and on TV, and we don't want to see that. That is not the image we want to project to the world. If you have to kill somebody, take them out back and shoot them in the head." See how much more moderate that is? So this is the difference between the two. One of them is thinking strategically and long-term, and the other guys are just like, I feel like cutting your throat, so I'm going to do it right now. It has nothing to do with moderation versus extremism. But if you wouldn't mind, General Howard, I'd like to just briefly give a historian's perspective on nation states and great power competition, because I feel that this is also something that's been kind of lacking from our discussion here. We're acting as if this is going to solve the problems of the Cold War. You know, 1992, I had lots of conversations with people and they were like panicking. Oh, the Cold War's over. How are we going to organize ourselves? We don't know what we're doing in the world. What's the place of the United States? And you had everybody who was like, you know, coming up with these, you know, sort of rubrics like the New World Order that had no content in them, right?
I was one of those people, by the way.
Yes, everybody was panicking. Then there was, we're going to have engagement and expansion. We don't know why we're expanding NATO, but it's engaging people and it's expanding, and they both start with E's, and that's going to be great. So, you know, people were really looking for something to replace the Cold War, and they were thinking something less dangerous. Great power competition sounds less dangerous. It sounds like we'll all be peers and we'll all be sort of competing like we do with businesses, and everything will be, you know, kind of hunky-dory because of that. When the truth is, great power competition in the 19th century led to multiple wars, including 2 world wars, that the Cold War managed to avoid. And we're seeing the return of that right now. Not in the sense that we're going to have, you know, armies marching across Europe, but you're going to have proxy forces fighting each other in deniable ways all around the globe, making the violence spread everywhere, but in ways that's easily deniable by states that don't feel that they can compete with us directly. So to me, it's going to lead to more violence. It's going to create a much unsafer world than we had even during the Cold War, at least before Vietnam. Because after Vietnam, everybody decided that the United States could be defeated as long as you just denied it was you doing it. By the way, Al-Qaeda did the same thing. They started calling themselves Ansar al-Sharia rather than Al-Qaeda, and we went along with the joke that it really wasn't them, right? And we're still doing it in lots of different places. We're pretending it's not Al-Qaeda out there doing it. Or ISIS, we have no trouble recognizing. Al-Qaeda, yes. Because we don't want to recognize we got a global problem, right? But the same kind of thing is going on with our global competition. And this is a fact of, you know, the great game to, you know, just about every other competition that occurred in the colonial world. So anyway, my point about it is we shouldn't embrace great power competition as if this is the solution to our, you know, problem of being the policeman of the world, which is, in my opinion, what's really behind this all. We think if we don't lead the charge, if we don't pretend we're in charge, we just put others forward, it'll make the world a safer place. Not true.
Dr. Habeck, I'd like to congratulate you, but also I have to, well, congratulate you for your final comments, because those were the exact comments I was going to make at the end of our session today. So now during the break, I have to come up with some new comments. No, it was very good, and I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. What a great panel. Congratulations for coming in on time and all your presentations, and I apologize for getting people mixed up in the questions, but you handled them all brilliantly. So thanks again for supporting us, and we look forward to seeing you here again sometime. Thank you.